Welcome to this next tutorial. In this tutorial we are going to be covering how to use Sculpt as a modeling technique for creating a lot of fine detail. Sculpt is similar to the tools that are available in ZBrush. It's Cinem4d's answer to ZBrush. And it allows us to do a lot of great things and model organic forms in a really intuitive way. One of the other things we can do with Sculpt is if you have a drawing tablet, all the Sculpt brushes respond to pen pressure. So you can use the drawing tablet to have a really fine-tuned control over how you're modifying the surface of your objects. So let's get started. And there's a couple ways that we can start by using Sculpt. So the first thing we can do is we'll need to create an object that we want to sculpt. And to begin with, we're going to start with a sphere. And with the sphere, the type of sphere we're going to choose is important because Sculpt works best with uniform polygons that are essentially four-sided or three-sided. So I'm going to put on Garage shading lines. So something that becomes really problematic is if we just leave the type of our sphere to standard, when we make this editable, which is a step we have to do, we're going to have this single point that all these polygons are joined to. And that is going to cause, it's going to make trying to manipulate anything on top of this object really frustrating. Even if we continue to subdivide the object, there's going to be this singular point in the middle. And what we want to do is we want to change this either to, you could totally do, a tetrahedron isn't probably the best option, either an icosahedron or a hexahedron, right? A hexahedron is essentially a cube that's been inflated. And so the polygons are all, they're quadrangles and they're pretty uniformly sized, right? They get a little smaller where the corners of the cube would have been. And then, the icosahedron is just even triangles all the way around the entire surface. And so either one of those options is good. We're going to go with the hexahedron, though, to start with. And once I've got this sphere set as a hexahedron, I'm going to go ahead and make it editable, right? So I can hit C on the keyboard or click the Make Editable button that's now grayed out up here and make this a polygon object. As soon as I do that, I can start editing this as a sculpt object. And so what I'm going to do is I have this object selected. I'm going to change my layout to sculpt. And as soon as I do that, all the sculpt tools are available and the screen changes a little bit. And so there's a few things we're going to talk about in this tutorial, and then we'll split things off and talk about some other settings in another tutorial. But to start with, we have all of these tools. We have pull, grab, smooth, wax, knife, pinch, etc. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I kind of want to, talk about how they work. So let's go ahead and click on grab. So I've got, so let's go ahead and click on grab. And with grab, you'll notice I do have attributes down here. I also have this layer, the Sculpting Layers menu up here, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But even before I create any layers or a base object or do anything, I can use these tools to start to manipulate the mesh of this object. And so, a couple other things. So I've got my settings here. You'll notice there's several tabs of options here. There's the base settings, which includes the size of the brush, this direction, which we'll talk about in a second, and then keep visual size. And then there's these checkboxes to link size, link pressure, and link symmetry. What that means is if I check mark link symmetry, then whatever I set my symmetry to here will transfer to the other tools, right? So if I was to say, oh, I want to, have symmetry so I can put two eyebrows on this face, then if I go and I make them they protrude too much and I need to smooth them out some, when I go to the smooth tool, that symmetry will still be there and I can smooth symmetrically as well. Right, so that's one of the really nice features of sculpting is that you can symmetrically do things either in two axes. So you can either do it like across the x-axis, you can do x and y, so you'd have like 4 points. You can do x, y, z, so you have 8 points that are being manipulated. And then they also have radial. So you can do radial like cuts in or radial bumps out or whatever on the surface of this object. Right, so the brush head, just to note, that little curve is the fall off, right? So if I go over, I don't know if I can see it on the grab. No, grab doesn't actually have fall off listed. Oh, it's right there, I'm just blind. Right, so this curve here is the curve that I'm seeing in the icon on the screen. Right, so that tells me what my fall off is like, right? So if I was to adjust this curve, and I actually need to pull the edge of this window over a little bit. There we go. All right, so if I was to adjust the shape of this curve by, say, making this more of a hump, then when I come over here, you'll see that that line has adjusted as well, so I have some sense of how the pressure is being distributed across the surface. Now, with grab, that doesn't really matter so much. But if I just click and drag, what I'm doing is I'm actually moving the surface of the mesh. And I can pull on points, I can pull on edges, I can pull on polygon faces. It really doesn't matter, right? But what it's doing is it's really allowing me to literally grab this mesh and move it around. And by default, if I go back to settings, the direction is mouse. That means that whatever direction I move my mouse is the direction that this gets pulled in, right? The other options I have is normal. And so what that means, right, is whatever direction this face or this vertex is pointing is the direction it will get pulled in. So if I do that, right, I can either, right, pull out this direction to pull forward, or I can go this direction to make it go into the mesh. If I'm on a polygon, right, I can do the same thing, but it's really pulling and pushing those polygons. And you'll notice that the brush size is meaning it's actually pushing a fair number there. Right, and so that's normal. I can also isolate the direction to be either X, Y, or Z, right? So if I do X, then no matter what I do, right, it's only going to be moving in the X direction, right, or along the red axis. The same with Z, etc. Okay, so those are the ways that we can start to manipulate this with grab. So let's go ahead and look at some of the other tools real quick. So smooth, surprisingly enough, smooths things. And you'll see my brush size is set to 30 right now. If I click on this, right, I have my smooth set to pressure set to 100%, so it's really smoothing it. But if I dial this pressure down to say 10%, then when I do this, and if I rotate my view a little bit, right, I can have better control of smoothing. And you can see as I drag across the surface, it smooths the whole thing out. Now, I've basically taken all of that stuff that I've made down, but we're going to look at some other tools that we can use. So the other tools, they all either build up or remove material. So wax essentially adds additional, you can imagine it as like, they would say like adding wax to a model, like you're actually like layering more material on top of this, right? Knife cuts, it makes a cut in the surface, so it makes a really, you can see how it's, as I'm clicking and dragging on that, it's cutting into that. Pinch does the opposite, where it will pull up an edge or a set of polygons, and I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to do that with this really low polygon mesh, but maybe if I run over this edge, it'll happen. Yeah, it's a little bit hard because I have so few polygons, and so some of these tools, you're not going to really notice how they work when we're working on a basic mesh like this. If I use flatten, right, basically it flattens sections out, and right now the pressure is 100. Right, if I make my size a lot larger, I should have a bigger impact there, and you can see how I'm flattening that surface out now, right, where this edge is here. Inflate, right, basically inflates things. You just have to kind of, I found that, you know, using it in terms of like rolling around in circles will do that. And we'll look at a finer mesh some of the ways that this works. Amplify amplifies any feature that's on there. It will either push, if it's going further back, it will push them further back. If it's going up, it'll amplify it in the other direction. Fill is sort of the opposite of cut, and it will fill in some spaces. Again, with the size and the pressure, it's really hard to, there we go. You can see this working now, right? With this mesh, it's hard to see that. And then repeat, we'll talk about in a little bit later, and scrape is sort of the opposite of wax, where it essentially scrapes or removes material and features from the surface. Okay, And then pull is more for stenciling and things like that, and we're not going to worry about pull right now. Okay, so those are our tools, right? They're all pretty simple. We'll talk about symmetry and some of the other things here in a little bit, and we'll break this up, but we're just going to cover kind of the basics right now. So the other thing is, right, I can just manipulate this mesh and then be happy with it. But if I want to get to the true power of Sculpt, what I need to do is I need to subdivide this, and I need to start using sculpting layers. And so to subdivide this object, go ahead and smooth it out, do whatever. It doesn't have to be what it was. You could also always delete this and put a normal sphere back in there, but I'm going to leave it as it is. I'm going to leave it as it is, and I'm going to click this subdivide button. As soon as I do that, it doesn't actually create any additional subdivisions yet, but it creates this base object in my sculpting layers. The base object is the object that you want to not manipulate beyond a certain point, right? This is your home base. This is the object that essentially what you do a lot of times is after you get done sculpting, you will bake all of this detail into textures that then get applied to this low polygon object. And so a lot of times, and that way it works. It's really nice for when you're, say, when you're transferring this to, say, a video game engine or something like that, where you have all of these layers that are able to capture some of the texture that you've created on the surface without all the polygons, right? And so, so I've got my object 0. And so what I want to do, and the 0 is the number of levels of subdivisions. And what's nice is you can create multiple levels of subdivisions, and you can create a layer for each one of those levels, and only do manipulations on each levels of subdivisions that make sense, right? So if I click on subdivide once, you'll see my base object now says level 1. And it's currently at level 1, and you'll see that there's this level slider here. Right now, the level is just either 0 or 1. If I put it on 0, my base object goes back to 0. If I put it on 1, my base object goes up to 1. So now that I've got this set to 1, I could come in here and manipulate my base object again, but that's usually a bad idea. So what I want to do is I want to create a new layer. And to do that, there's this button with an S and a plus sign on it. And that's going to allow me to create a new layer. And then when I have this layer highlighted in white, that means I have it selected. You'll notice I can't subdivide anything right now, but I have the strength setting here, and I can manipulate this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do with this base, with this first layer, I'm going to do large features. And so because we're just going to make a face, let's go ahead and look at symmetry while we do this. So I'm going to use the grab tool, and I'm going to go down to symmetry. And under the symmetry settings, I've got the axis is local, and I can do X, which is YZ, Y, which is ZX, or right, the third one, or I can do radial, and then when I do that, I can set the number of strokes and all that. We're not going to worry about that yet. I'm going to do X to start with, and when I come back over here, you'll see that there's a white dot off to the left, and that's my symmetrical thing. So if I was to go ahead and be down here, and let's go back to grab real quick and go to settings, and the direction is mouse. I'm going to set it, I'm going to leave it set to mouse. And I'm going to rotate my view a touch and just start to pull some of this mesh out. So, right, when we're working with these lower levels of subdivisions, the goal is to have, is basically to do some of the major features that we want, right? So if I want this, this character to, right, have a face that looks something like this, right? This is where I do this. I don't want to be doing this when I have about 8,000 polygons, right? And so right now my brush is too small and too strong for that. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the size up to 100. And I'm going to more gently push this geometry in to make the back of the head. And, I want to try and keep things pretty gentle in here. And I'm not going to do a great job with this model because just to keep, right, to make things, just to teach you the tools we can make a silly, ridiculous thing, right? We don't have to make something that's absolutely perfect. So I'm going to make some weird, strange alien head. I'm going to push these sides in a little bit. All right, so you can go ahead and continue sculpting on this in this mode if you'd like to. Pause the video and have some fun doing this. But I'm going to go ahead and shrink my brush down a little bit. And so, right, there's only so much detail I'm going to be able to get in this mesh, right, because it's pretty tiny. So if I pull, like I want, you know, eye sockets in here somewhere. And maybe what I want to do is I want to move this in the normal direction now, so I can actually say, let's pull eyes in, right? And I'm just using my mouse to do this, right? But I'm not going to get a really great result with the tools that I currently have available, right? So I'm going to need to do a little bit more work on later layers, right? But this is just for the basics. And I'm actually going to pull the bridge of the nose out a little bit more. Okay, all right, so I've got some basic shapes here. So now let's go ahead and we'll select our base object again. And now this subdivide button is not grayed out, so we can increase the level of subdivisions. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the level to 2. And again, I can create a new layer and continue to manipulate this on level 2. So let's say I want to bring out some of the features here and, you know, push some of the features in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to my Inflate tool, but before I do that, I want to check mark Link Symmetry, right? And so Link Symmetry is going to allow me to go over here to Inflate, and I still have my symmetry settings set. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a little inflation here, and you'll notice already the detail I'm getting when I'm doing this is much finer than it was previously. Right? I can get a lot finer detail on the work that I'm doing. Right? So I've inflated some of that. I really want this area to be tighter and not so broad because that's going to be the underside of his nose. So I'm going to go to the knife tool, and again I've got symmetry on, so I'm going to use the knife tool to cut a little edge in here, and you can see, right, how that's being applied. And, you know, I might actually go back to the grab tool and kind of push the bottom edge of this up a little bit, right, now that I've made some of the geometric change. And then I might want to cut in here around where the nostrils should be, so I'm going to use my knife again to kind of shape that a little bit more, right? Give it a little bit more definition. And again, there's only so much I'm going to be able to do. I might want to see if I can inflate where the lips would be a little bit. Right, so I've done a little inflation there, and maybe a little inflation on the chin. So he has a little tiny button chin. Something else, if I hold down Option or Alt, it will do the, oh, maybe not. If I hold down Command or Control, there it is. If I hold down Control will do the opposite, right? It will essentially deflate the area rather than inflate it, right? And so that's a quick way to kind of switch between, you know, the tool that you've just used and its opposite. And then I might want to inflate the brow just a little bit more all the way across. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this face at level 2. So let's go ahead and go back to our base object. Let's increase our, let's create another layer of subdivisions, and I'm actually going to create 2 more layers of subdivisions, so I'm at level 4. And something to note, when you're at a certain level, you can't manipulate the other layers. Like, I can't select those 2 layers because they're at different levels. And so let me go ahead and create a layer for this. All right, so layer 3 is set to 4 levels. But if I wanted to go back in and fix something on 1 or 2, I can just I select my base object, and I click on here until I get to the level that I want to manipulate. In this case, level 2, then I can select layer 2 and manipulate that. And so let's go back to layer 4, because I want to show you some of the finer detail we can get in here. So now what I can do is I can use the knife tool, and I can come in and I can add even more detail with this, right? I can cut around this nose a little bit more effectively, right? And so you can begin to see how these tools work, and how each level of subdivision allows you a lot more control than the previous level. And so, right, I can cut a little start of a mouth in there. It looks like I might need to inflate that a touch. Right, and so here we go. Let's go ahead and inflate that, inflate those lips. Now you'll notice that I made a mistake here, right? This is intersecting geometry, and we don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my smooth tool. I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to smooth that out, right? And so that smoothing is allowing me to make sure I don't have those intersections when I don't want them. Okay, now I've been leaving the subdivisions on, and I'm not going to do a whole lot. I want to get to a significantly higher level of subdivisions so that you can see the level of detail we can start to get on these things. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and quickly up my subdivisions 2 more layers. Right? Now I have this set to 6 layers of subdivisions. I have a boatload of polygons, and I'm going to have really great detail. However, if I try to manipulate this with the lines on, it really slows my computer down. So I'm going to go ahead and say display and just do garage shading. And now once I've done that, I want to show you how fine the detail is we can use. So if we go ahead and go to knife or pinch, let's go to pinch, we can start to get really, really fine levels of detail in this mesh, right? So you can see that, you know, even though I don't know what kind of person this is that would have some sort of alien, right? But you can see how close and sharp that detail can be. This is also a point where some of the other tools become usable. And so if I go to let's see here. If I go down to the really any of the tools, but let's start with pull. If I go to pull and I go down to stencil, and let's see here, do I have any presets? No, I'm going to have to do this later. Okay, if I go to stamp and I choose an image, so I click on the ellipsis over here. Just going to think about it for a second. Maybe there it goes. And I go and find some image, not that image. I'm actually going to use the leaf from one of our previous tutorials because that should be easy. And if I open that up and I use this as my thing and I start clicking and dragging, you'll see that what it's doing is it's creating a stamp of this leaf. And if I go ahead and go to my settings and increase the pressure to 100%, right, you can see that I'm actually able to apply texture. Now I'm just doing this with this leaf and I'm smearing it, and right, not exactly, you know, it actually looks kind of like scales, so that's pretty cool. But right, so I can go so far as to create really fine detail. Now, you know, the level of subdivisions is going to, you know, be the limit on how detailed this is. So you can see that even though I'm doing this, I've got, you know, pixelated, you know, my surfaces aren't so great, right? I can always come in and smooth this a little bit to soften those things back up so it's a little bit less rigid, or I can go try and add more polygons to the surface. Now there's a point where your computer is going to cry, and it's good to find that point now in a demo rather than finding it later on when you're working on a model and it crashes. It's really a really good idea to save your work frequently when you're working with Sculpt. Otherwise, it will crash occasionally. So I'm going to go ahead and try to add a couple more levels of subdivisions. Oh, I just did that on the base object too and not on my layer. So now that is sort of stuck on level 6 of my base object, which isn't what I wanted. And that's something else that always seems to happen. So I'm going to go one more subdivision level. You'll see now that in this little thing up here, it tells me how many polygons I have, which is like 2 million, and how many megabytes of RAM this is taking to render this, right? It's huge. And so that's something to be very, very aware of. So I'm going to go and create another layer. make sure I'm working on this layer. And now I'm going to go ahead and use that same, use the pull brush again to, and just to show you the level of detail I can get now, right? So before it was a little bit larger, and now, right, I'm still at 100%, which really you never want to use 100% pressure with these brushes because you just get too much pixelation. But, right, you can see if I make this a little bit smaller and maybe make this brush larger and zoom out, you can kind of see how this works. Right, so, you know, I've got these things, and I'm doing like a pretty subtle texture here. Right. Okay, but so now, and then if I go further over this, right, but this allows us, it allows you to really model an immense amount of texture on the surface of an object, right? And again, my computer is starting to run significantly slower with this level of detail applied. But you can see that I can get some pretty incredible results very quickly through modeling with Sculpt, right? It's a really useful tool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save this scene real quick because I'm nervous. And so let's put this in. I'm actually going to leave it in this tutorial for now. I'm just going to say Sculpt. Okay, so I want to show you a couple other things we can do before we go any further. So first, there is this option to mask. And if I click on the mask tool, what the mask tool does is it basically freezes whatever I paint and allows me to add detail to specific parts. So let's say I wanted to put a wart on this person's nose. To do that, I can make my brush size a lot smaller. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn symmetry off for the time being because I want this on one, I don't want this to be symmetrical. And so I'm just going to go ahead and brush on a little mask that's leaving like a hole in the middle, right? So anything that's dark gray is masked. Anything that's light gray is still going to be able to be manipulated by the brush. If I click on this mask button, you'll see I can invert it, I can clear it, I can hide it, or I can show it. And so I'm going to use the Inflate Brush, and I'm going to go ahead and make my brush size smaller, so I'm only impacting the area in here. And I'm going to turn symmetry off. And I'm going to go ahead and start to inflate this. Right, and so now what I've done is I've created a feature that, granted I went a little bit crazy, but I've created a feature that has a hard edge against the rest of the object, right? And if I wanted to inflate around this, I don't know why this person would have this feature, but why not? We're just going to go ahead and do that. And you'll notice that, right, I'm getting a pretty firm edge between those two things. And I could come in here and use smooth again to just smooth this seam out a little bit. To soften that edge, or I could turn my mask off and do the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and actually turn my symmetry off on this. And then I'm going to go ahead and go to my mask, and I'm going to clear my mask. And then now I can go ahead and smooth this area a little bit. And you can see that some of that pixelated looking or aliased looking edge is starting to go away. And I'm intentionally using a pretty mellow setting on my brush so that I don't take away too much of that detail too quickly. Okay, right, so masks are an option. You can actually use an image, much like I did with the stencil. You can use that to mask certain things off. There's all sorts of interesting things you can do, and there's a bunch of presets that I forgot to load that allow you to apply different textures and materials, and we can talk about those more in a later demo. The last thing I want to cover is one other way that you can create objects to mesh. So let's go ahead, I'm going to save this again, and I'm going to go to my Objects Manager. By the way, all in this mode, you'll notice that my object manager is here on the left side. And if I come down here, attributes, layers, structure, materials, and coordinates. So if I need to deal with materials, I have that available here, as well as attributes. Okay, so I'm going to deselect this object, right? And I'm actually going to hide the object as well, because I don't need that. Notice that if I've sculpted an object, it gets this sculpt tag, right? And that basically, you know, tells Cinem4d what to do. We can freeze this as well, so we can kind of lock it so it doesn't get manipulated on accident. But what I would like you to do now is to, let's go ahead and just take a few objects, like a cube, and I'm going to use the scale tool, and I'm just going to go ahead and make this object a little bit smaller so I can see it in my view a little bit better. And then let's go ahead and create something else. You know, we've done toruses before. Let's just do a sphere. And again, we're going to scale the sphere down. I'm going to hit the letter E. And let's move this. And I'm going to intentionally intersect, let's say 3 or 4 objects. I'm going to use a torus. I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees-ish, shrink the ring around it, and then move it a little bit. Right? So now I've got all of these geometries put together. And let's say that I want to be able to sculpt this crazy combination of objects. So how do I do that? The way I do that is I select all 3 of these in my hierarchy, and I go to this volume mesh. Now, if I just click the button, that actually worked out better than I expected. I'm going to undo that. And then I'm going to select these objects again. And if I click on the settings, what this does is you'll notice from the volume builder, right, we have some similar settings. We have voxel size, and we have this pre-subdivide option, which I'm going to leave at 0. And then we have the ability to smooth these objects, right? And so I'm going to set my voxel size to 1 inch, and I'm going to set my smooth to something really small. I've found that if you smooth too much, it changes dramatically. And so I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And when I do that, what it does is it basically takes all of these objects that I've had, and in this case, it didn't do the best job, but it does the steps of the volume builder very, very quickly to this mesh, right? And I could have subdivided this more, but then once I've got this object, now I can use sculpt tools on it, right? So if I wanted to, say, smooth some of these weird edges out, I can do that, right? And I can basically sculpt this object that I built very, very quickly out of other objects, and use the volume, basically the volume builder engine, to create the object that I want. Now, if I use the volume builder first, I can always use the volume builder, make that final object editable, and then bring it in and work on it. And I'd have a lot more control with the different filters and things that you can use in the volume builder and volume mesher, right? And so this is just one last way that you can very quickly make something that you can then sculpt, right? And I can subdivide it and go back to my sculpting layers and make sure I actually have the right object selected, which if I go back to objects, I want to make sure that this is the one that, there we go. I click on Show Layer Manager, and it's going to pop this up. I have my base object at 0. If I add a layer, right, it's at 0 as well. If I go ahead and select my base object, I can subdivide this again, and again, and again, right? And then I can add a layer there, and now I can start to, right, I can continue to manipulate this object, right, much like I would with any other sculpt tools, right? And so there's a lot of ways that you can work with this. It's a really powerful way to create things that, you know, need organic surfaces. And you'll see that actually I have symmetry turned on the knife apparently, because I just symmetrically did that. I'm going to step back a few steps. And maybe I'll just go to inflate since I know that that's not on, right? And so, right, I can go around and do my inflations and have fun building these objects and manipulating them in this way. So this is just one other way you can start that process. In the next tutorial, we'll look at some more ways you can use some of the sculpt tools to do really interesting things. Thanks for listening. Okay, so hello and welcome to the next part. So using the model that we created in the previous sculpting tutorial, and you'll see I added a few details after the tutorial just because it was fun to add a little bit more things to it. I wanted to show you a couple little things with the tools. The thing I want to show you is what happens, I realized I didn't really go over what happens when you make major changes to one of the lower surface, one of the lower layer objects. Sorry, one of the object's lower layers. And what happens to the geometry that you've created on that top layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to select the base object, and we will drop back down to level 1. And then I'm going to select my layer 1. I'm going to rotate my view a bit so I can see the nose, that's the tip of that nose coming out. And I'm going to make sure I could either use direction set with the grab tool, is what we're going to use, set to normal, or I could do it in the direction of the mouse. It really doesn't matter because either way this is going to come out. And all we're going to do is we're going to pull his nose out somewhat ridiculously far. Right? So this is just that one vertex that kind of makes the tip of the nose. And so we've made that change. So let's go ahead and select our base object again. Take our level and go all the way up to 7. And then once that updates, you'll see the change that made to this model, right? So it allowed me to really quickly make a major change to this character's features, and I could do similar things like, this head. He's got a lot of weight and mass to his face here. And so something I could do is I could go onto that first level and I could actually pull in these. I could also give him a stronger chin at that level. And that would totally reshape the face of his figure. So those are things, that's a little bit about more about what I wanted to show you. And the other thing I want to show you is the other type of symmetry. Because we haven't really looked at that yet. I'm trying to find an object, a part of the head that I'm not totally going to draw all the way through with this. So let's go ahead and maybe we'll use the Inflate tool, just so what we're doing is really obvious. And that's going to be a little big. I'm going to set the size to 11 and the pressure to maybe 30 or 40%, somewhere in there. Okay, and so then what I need to do is I need to go to Symmetry, and I need to uncheck the XY. We haven't done this, but if I check mark 2 of these fields and I'm in the right view, I actually have 4 points where things are going, right? So I can, I can make something that is symmetrical in 4 directions, and that actually looks pretty better than I expected. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that there. Right, so I can check mark the Z, and then I actually have uniform points around the entire surface of the object that I'm working on. And so those are 3 options. And then the other option is radial, right? So if I check mark radial, what it does is it allows me to have it either radial symmetry in the XY plane, in the XZ plane, right, or the YZ plane, or points. And it allows me to adjust the number of radial strokes or the gap angle between those different radians. And you can see this is set to 0, right? So if I adjust this a little bit, you can see now along the XZ axis, I could create a series of 2 sets of 2 points all the way around with this 14-degree gap between them. Right, so if I was to click on this and start to do something, just a little something, because I should be doing this on the lower level of polygons, right? But so I can create these radial lines or radial features that go along the entire surface of this object. If I change to XZ, right, it's going to do radial effects in this direction. If I change to ZY, right, it's going to go from top to bottom. And if I change to point, what it's going to do is, let's see here. What it's going to do is allow me to click in one point and pull out from that point, right? And so then I can make things like, you know, this shape or whatever I want to do, right? You can see my computer's lagging a bit because I'm moving a ton of geometry doing this, right? But so this is the other way, right? So that all those lines radiate out from a single point. I'm going to undo that. And custom point basically, I think, just allows you to set where the point is. Oh, maybe it just draws it a little bit differently. Yeah, actually, it's letting me set, right, a point in the center or a place to go from the center. Right, so it's just a little bit different way of using the tool. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and undo that as well. You know, I like that thing on the back of his head. I'm not so sure I'm super crazy about, oops. I'm not so sure I am super crazy about his head. Oh, and something else to note, I think we talked about this before, but if you get things that start to look like this, that means your geometry is starting to fold in on itself, and you'll get weird artifacts if you're close to the surface. And so one way to remedy that is just to go to smooth, and if you smooth it just a little bit, usually that will pull any of those things out, right? It does depend on, you know, how deep you've you've pressed it, but and this probably wouldn't be too much of an issue here, but if I just soften it a little bit, I'll make sure that if there were any problems with that material, with a material on there, I wouldn't be in too much trouble.